The cable arrived at the Kremlin at 04:17 Moscow time, November 23, 1962. Frost clung to the windows of the Central Committee communications room. The duty officer's hand trembled as he decoded the message from Ambassador Dobrynin in Washington. Not from fear of the words themselves, but from what they confirmed about the man who had sent American destroyers to within visual range of Soviet submarines 28 days earlier. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev read it twice in his private study, the radiator ticking in the corner, his reading glasses catching the lamplight. He set the paper down and walked to the window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. For the first time since Stalin's death, the first secretary of the Communist Party felt something he had not experienced in a decade of political survival. The cold certainty that he was facing an opponent who understood the one weapon Khrushchev could not counter. Here is the paradox that destroyed Soviet confidence in their own doctrine. John Fitzgerald Kennedy never commanded a division, never studied at a military academy, never rose through the apparatus of institutional power that defined both Soviet and American Cold War leadership. Yet within 18 months of taking office, this 43-year-old president had forced the Soviet Union into the most humiliating strategic retreat in its history, not through superior firepower or industrial capacity, but through a psychological weapon the Kremlin had believed was exclusively theirs. The mystery we are about to solve is this: what did Kennedy possess that Eisenhower, Truman, and every Cold War president before him lacked? What single capability made Khrushchev write in his private diary, never intended for publication, that Kennedy was the most dangerous American we have ever faced? The answer will require us to examine 3 moments of institutional arrogance, 1 technical revolution in decision-making, and a final confrontation that revealed the true nature of Cold War power. By the end, you will understand why the Soviet Politburo, in a closed session on December 3, 1962, discussed for the first time the possibility that their entire model of superpower competition had been rendered obsolete by a president they had initially dismissed as a rich boy playing at statecraft. Before we decode that weapon, understand this: what you are about to hear contradicts 50 years of Cold War mythology. The common narrative says Kennedy won the Cuban Missile Crisis through naval blockade and nuclear brinkmanship. The classified truth, buried in Kremlin archives until 1992 and cross-referenced with declassified NSC transcripts in 1997, reveals something far more devastating to Soviet doctrine. If you want to understand how psychological warfare actually functions at the state level, how intelligence becomes a weapon more powerful than megatonnage, how one man's capacity for a specific type of calculation can rewrite the balance of power, then stay. With this investigation, the next 30 minutes will show you the real machinery of Cold War dominance. The arrogance began in Vienna, June 3, 1961. The Soviet Embassy, Schönbrunn Palace Annex. Khrushchev sat across from Kennedy in a room prepared for intimidation, heavy drapes, formal portraiture, the scent of old tobacco and furniture polish. The first secretary had spent 3 days reviewing psychological profiles prepared by KGB analysts. Their assessment: Kennedy was inexperienced, traumatized by the Bay of Pigs disaster 8 weeks earlier, desperate to prove himself, vulnerable to pressure. Khrushchev opened with a calculated insult disguised as philosophy. He lectured Kennedy on historical inevitability, on the scientific certainty of socialism's triumph, on the foolishness of resisting the tide of liberation movements in the Third World. He spoke for 47 minutes without interruption. Kennedy's translator, Alexander Akalovsky, would later describe the president's expression as unnaturally still. When Khrushchev finished, Kennedy responded with a single question about agricultural productivity in Ukraine. The question was technical, specific, and based on data the Soviets had not published. Khrushchev deflected. Kennedy asked a follow-up about wheat yields versus stated quotas. Then a third question about the timing of a particular Central Committee resolution on collective farm reform. The Soviet interpreter, Viktor Sukhadrev, noticed Khrushchev's jaw tighten. The first secretary changed subjects to Berlin. Kennedy let him talk, then asked about the tonnage capacity of the Soviet rail system connecting Berlin to the Western occupation zones. Khrushchev, growing irritated, accused Kennedy of trying to impress him with homework. Kennedy smiled and said nothing. That evening, Khrushchev cabled Moscow with his assessment. The cable, declassified in 1995, contains this line: "The young president is clever but weak. He asks questions to hide his lack of answers. He can be pressured. He will break before we do." 3 members of the Politburo laughed when the cable was read aloud. One of them, Anastas Mikoyan, wrote in his personal notes that Kennedy had the look of a student who had crammed for an exam but did not understand the subject. The consensus in Moscow was clear. Kennedy was an intellectual pretending to be a strategist, a man who collected facts but lacked the ideological certainty to act on them. This was the first and most catastrophic misreading of the Kennedy capability. The Soviets had mistaken data collection for weakness. They had interpreted Kennedy's questions as defensive posturing rather than what they actually were. Active intelligence gathering in real time, performed by a mind that processed information faster than any American president before him. But the Kremlin would not understand this until it was far too late. The second arrogance came 14 months later in the form of a decision that seemed to Soviet planners both rational and risk-free. July 1962. The Ministry of Defense, Frunzenskaya Embankment, Moscow. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky presented the plan to deploy R-12 and R-14 medium-range ballistic missiles to Cuba. The operation, codenamed Anadir, would place nuclear-capable missiles 90 miles from Florida, equalizing the strategic imbalance created by American Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. The plan assumed Kennedy would react like Eisenhower had reacted to the U-2 incident, with public outrage, private negotiation, and eventual acceptance of the new reality. The psychological profile was updated but unchanged in its core assessment. Kennedy was a pragmatist who valued image over action, a president who would choose face-saving diplomacy over military confrontation. Khrushchev approved the operation on July 7th. He told the Presidium, "Kennedy will make noise, but he will not act. He is too intelligent to risk war over an island that means nothing to American security." The transcript records laughter at this line. The first R-12 missiles arrived in Cuba on September 8, 1962, aboard the freighter Omsk. By October 14th, CIA U-2 reconnaissance had photographed the San Cristobal site, revealing launch positions under construction. Kennedy received the photographic evidence on the morning of October 16th. What happened next destroyed every assumption the Soviets had built about American presidential decision-making. Kennedy did not convene the full National Security Council. He did not call an emergency cabinet meeting. He did not immediately consult the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Instead, he assembled a group that had no formal name, no official charter, no place in the constitutional chain of command. 16 men, selected not for rank, but for a specific cognitive capability. The ability to argue multiple contradictory positions simultaneously without ego attachment to any single outcome. This was the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, and it represented a revolution in how decisions could be made under existential pressure. For 6 days, Kennedy did something no Soviet leader could do within the structure of democratic centralism. He forced his advisors to switch sides in the debate. The men arguing for immediate airstrikes on Monday were required to argue against airstrikes on Tuesday. The men proposing blockade had to articulate the case for invasion. Kennedy himself took no position. He asked questions. He tested contradictions. He demanded that every option be defended by someone who had previously opposed it. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who attended all 43 hours of EXCOM meetings, later described the process as intellectual combat designed to kill certainty. Kennedy was not seeking consensus. He was constructing a decision-making architecture that could out-process the Soviet system. The Soviets, monitoring American communications and diplomatic traffic, interpreted the delay as paralysis. On October 19th, Soviet intelligence reported to Moscow that Kennedy was trapped between his military advisors and his political fears. The assessment concluded that the United States would likely accept the missiles in exchange for a face-saving concession, probably a pledge not to invade Cuba. Khrushchev, reading these reports in his dacha outside Moscow, felt confident enough to approve the acceleration of missile assembly. He cabled Havana. Proceed at maximum speed. The Americans are hesitating. He had mistaken Kennedy's process for indecision. He had interpreted the absence of immediate action as weakness. He did not understand that Kennedy was doing something the Soviet system could not replicate. He was building a decision that could withstand every possible countermove before committing to action. On October 22nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Kennedy addressed the nation. 50 million Americans watched. The speech lasted 17 minutes. Kennedy's voice was calm, his language precise. He announced a naval quarantine of Cuba, demanded the removal of all offensive weapons, and placed American strategic forces at DEFCON 2 for the first time in history. But the speech itself was not the weapon. The weapon was what Kennedy had done in the 6 days before the speech. He had already wargamed every possible Soviet response and prepared a counter-response for each. He had positioned naval assets not just to blockade Cuba, but to execute any of 7 different escalation options within 4 hours. He had coordinated with allies to ensure political isolation of the Soviet position. He had drafted letters to Khrushchev for 3 different scenarios, each calibrated to offer a face-saving exit while maintaining maximum pressure. The Soviets, receiving reports of American military movements, suddenly realized they were not facing a president making threats. They were facing a president who had already made his decision and had constructed an operational architecture that anticipated their next 5 moves. This was the ghost effect. Every option the Soviets considered had already been closed. Every countermove had been preempted. They were fighting an opponent who was not reacting to them but had already mapped the entire decision tree and occupied every branch. On October 24th, Soviet freighters carrying additional missiles approached the quarantine line. Khrushchev had ordered them to proceed, believing Kennedy would not risk sinking Soviet vessels. At 10:25 a.m., the freighters stopped in the water, engines idling 18 miles from the quarantine boundary. In the Kremlin, confusion turned to alarm. The ships had not been ordered to stop. The captains had made the decision independently, based on their assessment that the American destroyers were not bluffing. For the first time, Soviet commanders in the field were refusing to follow Moscow's orders because they believed the American president had already decided to act. Khrushchev, receiving this news, understood that he had lost control of the escalation dynamic. Kennedy had created a situation where Soviet officers trusted the American president's resolve more than their own leadership's assurances. The technical term for this is credibility inversion. It occurs when an opponent's demonstrated decision-making capability becomes more predictable than your own command structure. Kennedy had achieved it in 8 days. But the real devastation was still to come. October 27, 1962. The crisis reached its apex. A Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile shot down a U-2 over Cuba, killing the pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson. The Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended immediate retaliatory airstrikes. ExComm convened an emergency session. The room in the cabinet room basement smelled of coffee and cigarette ash. Men had been awake for 36 hours. Kennedy asked a single question. If we strike the SAM sites, what is the probability that Khrushchev can control the Soviet response? The question revealed the weapon. Kennedy was not asking about American capabilities. He was asking about Soviet command and control fragility. He had identified the asymmetry. The Soviet system required centralized approval for escalation, but their forces in Cuba were operating under pre-delegated authority due to communication delays. Kennedy understood that Khrushchev could not guarantee restraint from his own commanders. This meant that any American military action would trigger a Soviet response that Khrushchev might not intend but could not prevent. Kennedy had discovered that the Soviet command structure was more dangerous to Khrushchev than it was to the United States. He decided to exploit this vulnerability not through escalation, but through a private channel that bypassed official diplomacy entirely. He sent his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to meet secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The message was carefully constructed. The United States would publicly agree to never invade Cuba and would privately agree to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months, but only if the Soviet missiles were withdrawn immediately and the concession on Turkey remained secret. The genius of the offer was that it gave Khrushchev exactly what he needed: a victory he could claim domestically, saving Cuba from invasion, and a strategic gain he could cite privately to the Presidium: removal of Turkish missiles, while requiring him to accept public humiliation, withdrawing the Cuban missiles under American pressure. Kennedy had designed a solution that exploited the Soviet system's need for internal narrative control. He understood that Khrushchev's political survival depended on being able to tell two different stories to two different audiences, and Kennedy had constructed an outcome that made that possible while ensuring American strategic dominance. Dobrynin cabled Moscow at 9:15 p.m. on October 27th. Khrushchev read the proposal at 3:00 a.m. Moscow time on October 28th. He convened an emergency presidium meeting at 6 a.m. The debate lasted 47 minutes. Khrushchev argued for acceptance. Marshal Malinovsky argued for standing firm. Khrushchev cut him off and said, according to the meeting transcript, "Kennedy has built a cage around every option we have. If we do not accept, we will be forced to accept worse terms under military pressure. He has outthought us." At 9 a.m. Moscow time, Radio Moscow broadcast Khrushchev's acceptance. The crisis was over. The humiliation was total. The Soviet Union had deployed strategic weapons to Cuba in secret, been discovered, been blockaded, and been forced to withdraw under threat of military action, all while the American president maintained public support and Allied unity. The United States had achieved its objectives without firing a shot in anger. But the numbers tell the deeper story. In the 18 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union had won strategic victories in Laos, the Congo, and Berlin. They had forced Kennedy into a humiliating summit in Vienna. They had built the Berlin Wall without American military response. They had shot down a U-2 over Cuba without consequence. The trend line suggested Soviet strategic momentum. In the 18 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union won 0 major strategic confrontations with the United States. 0. The reversal was absolute. Kennedy had demonstrated a capability that changed the calculus of every subsequent Cold War engagement. He could process complex multivariable scenarios faster than the Soviet collective leadership system, construct responses that preempted countermoves, and maintain decision coherence under existential pressure. The Soviets called an emergency conference of Warsaw Pact intelligence chiefs in January 1963 to analyze what had gone wrong. The KGB produced a 247-page assessment, declassified in 1998, that concluded, "Kennedy possesses a decision-making velocity that our system cannot match. He converts information into action faster than our command structure can formulate response. This is a technological gap more significant than any weapon system." They had discovered that Kennedy's mind was a weapon system they had no counter for. But why? What was the actual mechanism? What did Kennedy do that Eisenhower, Truman, and every other Cold War president could not? The answer lies in three specific capabilities that Kennedy had developed before he ever entered politics, capabilities that were invisible to Soviet analysts because they were not looking for them. First, Kennedy had spent his entire adult life studying decision-making under uncertainty. His senior thesis at Harvard, published as Why England Slept, was an analysis of how the British government failed to respond to the Nazi threat despite having complete information. He had identified the institutional barriers that prevent organizations from acting on intelligence they possess. This was not abstract theory. This was a diagnostic manual for bureaucratic paralysis, and Kennedy had internalized it. Second, Kennedy had commanded a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific during World War II. PT-109 was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer on August 2, 1943. Kennedy spent 15 hours in the water, towing a wounded crewman by clenching the man's life jacket strap in his teeth, swimming 3 miles to a small island. He had experienced the absolute clarity that comes from making decisions when death is the cost of error. He knew the difference between theoretical risk and actual mortality. This gave him a calibration advantage over advisors who had never faced personal physical consequences for strategic mistakes. Third, and most critical, Kennedy was a speed reader who had trained himself to process 1,200 words per minute with 95% retention. He consumed intelligence briefings, diplomatic cables, technical reports, and historical analyses at a rate that allowed him to maintain a real-time information advantage over every person in any meeting he attended. While his advisors were reading summaries, Kennedy had read the source documents. While they were forming opinions based on briefings, Kennedy had already cross-referenced contradictory data and identified gaps. This was the weapon. Kennedy had built a personal intelligence processing system that operated faster than institutional decision-making. He could outread, out-analyze, and outthink the collective Soviet leadership because he had trained himself to function as a single-person OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. The Soviets, who had built their entire system on the assumption that collective decision-making was superior to individual authority, had encountered a president who had optimized individual decision-making to the point where it outperformed their collective model. They had no doctrine for this, no counter-strategy, no institutional response. Khrushchev understood it first. In his private diary entry dated November 30, 1962, he wrote, "We prepared for a president who would need to consult his generals, his Congress, his allies. Instead, we faced a president who had already consulted them before we made our move. He is always 3 steps ahead because he has already walked the entire path in his mind. This is not leadership as we understand it. This is something else." What Khrushchev could not write, because it would have been ideological heresy, was that Kennedy had proven that a single sufficiently intelligent individual with the right cognitive tools could defeat a collective system designed to eliminate individual error through group deliberation. This was the fear. Not fear of American nuclear superiority, which the Soviets were rapidly matching. Not fear of NATO, which had shown itself divided and hesitant. Fear of a president who could think faster than the Politburo could meet. The final proof came in June 1963. Kennedy delivered a speech at American University that Soviet analysts initially dismissed as propaganda. The speech called for a re-examination of Cold War attitudes, proposed a nuclear test ban treaty, and announced that the United States would unilaterally halt atmospheric nuclear testing. The Soviets had heard American peace proposals before. They were usually negotiating tactics designed to score propaganda points while maintaining military pressure. But Kennedy's speech was different. It contained specific technical proposals that could only have been written by someone who understood the Soviet internal debate about the costs of continued testing. KGB analysis of the speech, declassified in 2003, noted with alarm that Kennedy had referenced internal Soviet discussions about radioactive fallout that had not been made public. He had quoted a Soviet scientist's estimate of genetic damage from strontium-90 that existed only in classified Ministry of Health documents. He had demonstrated that American intelligence had penetrated Soviet scientific institutions at a level the KGB had not detected. But more devastating than the intelligence penetration was what Kennedy did next. He had already drafted the test ban treaty before giving the speech. He had already secured British agreement. He had already prepared the Senate ratification strategy. He had already calculated that Khrushchev needed a foreign policy victory to offset the Cuban humiliation, and that a test ban treaty was the only option that served both American and Soviet interests. The treaty was signed on August 5, 1963, less than 60 days after the speech. This was unprecedented velocity for a major arms control agreement. Kennedy had compressed a process that normally took years into 8 weeks because he had done all the preparatory work before making the proposal public. Khrushchev, signing the treaty in Moscow, understood that he had been outmaneuvered again. Kennedy had given him a victory that was actually an American strategic gain. The test ban froze Soviet atmospheric testing, which they needed more than the United States did to validate new warhead designs, while allowing underground testing where American seismic detection capabilities gave them an intelligence advantage. The Soviet premier had accepted a treaty that he thought was a concession to Soviet demands for peaceful coexistence, only to discover later that it had been designed to constrain Soviet weapons development while appearing to be a mutual compromise. This was Kennedy's final demonstration of the capability that Khrushchev feared, the ability to construct outcomes that looked like negotiations but were actually predetermined results dressed in the language of diplomacy. On October 14, 1964, the Soviet Presidium voted to remove Khrushchev from power. The official charges were harebrained scheming and reckless foreign policy. The real reason, stated clearly in the private deliberations recorded by KGB stenographers, was that Khrushchev had been humiliated by Kennedy and had failed to develop a counter-strategy. 1 year and 29 days after Kennedy's assassination. The timing was not coincidental. The Presidium had waited to see if Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, would demonstrate the same capability. When Johnson's initial decisions showed a more conventional pattern, consulting widely, building consensus, following institutional process, the Presidium concluded that the Kennedy threat had been personal, not systemic. They moved against Khrushchev because he had lost to a capability that no longer existed, and his continued leadership was a reminder of that defeat. But they had misunderstood the lesson. Kennedy had not defeated the Soviet Union through personal genius. He had defeated them by building a decision-making process that could be replicated. XCOM's structure, the OODA loop optimization, the integration of intelligence into real-time strategy, the pre-gaming of opponent responses. The tragedy was that Johnson did not replicate it. Nixon tried and failed. Ford never attempted it. Carter built a version, but lacked Kennedy's processing speed. Reagan had the instinct, but not the technical rigor. It would take until the end of the Cold War for American decision-making to again achieve the velocity Kennedy had demonstrated in 1962. And by then, the Soviet system had already collapsed under the weight of its own inability to process information faster than events required decisions. Return now to that cable from November 23, 1962. Khrushchev standing at the window, frost on the glass, reading Dobrynin's assessment of Kennedy's post-crisis mood. The cable reported that Kennedy had shown no triumphalism, no public gloating, no attempt to exploit the Soviet humiliation for domestic political gain. Instead, Kennedy had immediately proposed new areas of cooperation: space exploration, cultural exchange, grain sales. Khrushchev understood what his advisors did not. Kennedy was not being magnanimous, he was being strategic. He had already moved to the next decision tree: how to prevent Khrushchev's political destruction from destabilizing the Soviet leadership and producing a more hostile successor. Kennedy was managing Khrushchev's survival because he had calculated that a weakened Khrushchev was more useful than an unknown replacement. This was the capability that Khrushchev feared most. Not that Kennedy could defeat him, but that Kennedy could defeat him and then decide whether to let him survive, all as part of a single continuous strategic calculation. The first secretary set the cable down and returned to his desk. He wrote a personal letter to Kennedy, delivered through back channels, that has never been fully declassified. The portions that have been released contain this line: "You have taught me that the future belongs to those who can think faster than their enemies can act. I do not know if my system can learn this lesson. It could not." The Soviet Union would continue for another 27 years, but it never again achieved strategic surprise against the United States. Every major Cold War confrontation after Cuba, Vietnam, the Middle East, Afghanistan, the arms race, followed patterns that American intelligence could predict because the Soviet decision-making system remained fundamentally unchanged. Kennedy had exposed the fatal flaw. Collective decision-making optimized for ideological correctness could not compete with individual decision-making optimized for speed and accuracy. The final irony is that Kennedy himself did not live to see the full implications of what he had proven. He was assassinated on November 22, 1963, 13 months and 3 days after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. But the fear he had created in Khrushchev outlived both men. In 1970, Khrushchev, living in forced retirement, gave a secret interview to a Soviet journalist that was not published until after the fall of the USSR. Asked which American president he considered the most formidable, Khrushchev answered, "Kennedy was the only one who frightened me. Not because of his weapons, because of his mind. He could see around corners. He could anticipate what we would do before we had decided to do it. That is a terrible power in an enemy." The journalist asked if Khrushchev thought Kennedy would have prevented the Soviet collapse if he had lived longer. Khrushchev's answer, "No, he would have accelerated it. He had already found the crack in our system. He would have kept pressing until the whole structure came down. We were very lucky he died when he did." This is the truth that Cold War mythology obscures. Kennedy did not win the Cuban Missile Crisis through brinkmanship or nuclear threats. He won it through a capability that the Soviet system could not match and could not counter: the ability to make better decisions faster than his opponent could formulate responses. And Khrushchev knew it. In Vienna, he had laughed at the young president's questions. In Moscow, he had mocked Kennedy's inexperience. In Cuba, he had bet that Kennedy would hesitate. By November 1962, he understood that he had been fighting a president who had already won the confrontation before it began, who had mapped every possible outcome and selected the one that guaranteed Soviet defeat while minimizing Soviet humiliation. That is why Khrushchev feared Kennedy more than any American president. Not because Kennedy was more aggressive, or more ideological, or more willing to risk war. Because Kennedy had built a weapon the Soviets had no defense against, a mind that could outprocess their entire system. And in the Cold War, where the ultimate battlefield was decision-making under existential pressure, that weapon was absolute.